Daf Yomi Bava 91b. We're at the Gemara right after the second Mishnah. Okay, so we saw in the Mishnah two things. Number one is that you cannot eat in a different variety. The second thing was that, technically speaking, you're only allowed to eat while you're in the middle of working. However, because that interferes, distracts from work, the rabbis enacted a decree that while the workers are having their downtime, they're walking from tree to tree or row to row, they're allowed to eat as well. We started off an interesting question in the Gemara. Question was, the Mishnah designates a different variety as problematic. What happens if it's the same variety, it's just a different tree? I'm working on one tree and I'm eating a different tree. So the Gemara is, is that permitted? Can I work on one tree and eat it from a different tree? And the Gemara says, well, wouldn't you think this is obvious? Because every time you have an ox that's eating, obviously he's eating in a different tree than he's working at, because he's pulling a wagon behind him, and obviously this, an ox is a big animal. So how is it possible for him to be helping the harvesters in one tree and eating from that tree? And the Gemara says, b'sircha, it's talking about a very, very long tree. So it's a long vine, and the vine is long enough that the animal can work in one half and eat on the other half. In other words, should we resolve this Gemara that should we resolve this that you must eat from the same tree that you're working on? Then the truth of the matter is the only tree an animal would be able to eat from is this very interesting scenario where the tree is very long. Okay, and now we're at two lines into the wide lines. Toshma, second wide line. If he was working with the figs, he should not eat with the grapes. In other words, the implication of the Mishnah is that you can't eat a second variety, but in the same variety under the same circumstances, you could eat it. Meaning, I'm working on this tree, which is a grape tree, and I'm not allowed to eat its neighboring tree, which is a fig tree. But if this fig tree would have been a grape tree, then I would have been allowed to eat. The only reason why I can't eat from the fig tree is because it's a fig tree, because it's a different variety, even though they're next to each other. Obviously, they'd have to be spaced a certain amount because of the laws of Klayam. But if not for that, I would be able to eat from it. If I had two fig trees that were set up exactly as a fig tree and a grape tree would be set up, so the fig tree and the grapevine I would not be allowed to eat, but the fig tree and the fig tree I would be able to eat, even though it's not the same tree. If I'm working with one vine, I'm not permitted to eat from a different vine. How is this possible? So Amar Shisha Breder of Idi be mudless. 1 second. Okay, mudless means that one tree was growing over the other tree. So grapevine, obviously, these things, the grapes, they tend to stick to a lot of surfaces. So the grapevine was growing over the fig tree, and now he's picking figs, and he wants to know if he's allowed to eat the grapes that are growing on the same tree because they're hanging over. So because it's a different variety, he's not allowed to eat, even though it's on the same tree. But if it was the same variety, meaning you had two fig trees that were interwoven with each other, and you're working on one, you'd be allowed to eat from the other one. That it's not called eating from a different one. You're eating from the same one because it's hanging over that one. So again, there isn't really much of a proof to the question of, can I eat on a different vine that I'm working on? All we've said is that if that vine is hanging over the vine that I'm working on, then I would be allowed to eat from it. But if it's a different vine in a different place, it's not clear that I would be permitted to eat from it. Toshma. Okay, so we explained that a person is allowed to prepare himself to be hungry to eat from the fruit while he's working. So he gets to the best trees and he wants to eat from there. That's permitted. But if you're allowed to eat from one vine while you're working on a different vine, then why do you need to wait until you get to the good vine? Just move back and forth. Work on one vine, go to the good vine, pick your good grapes, and come back. The Gemara says, no, you're not allowed to. One second. Okay, so the Gemara explains. In other words, in that scenario, obviously you can't do this because the time that you're going, so you're working on this row of grapes, but you want to eat this row because this is the best row. So you're walking back and forth. Obviously, you're not allowed to do that. That's why you have to be hungry until you get to that row, and then you could start eating from it. So obviously, that's not included in the question. The question the Gemara is asking is, let's say he's working with his son and his wife who are not hired. Can they bring him from a different vine? If he's working himself, obviously he can't distract himself. He can only eat while he's on the job. But the question is, can his wife and his son who are not hired, can they bring him fruit from a different tree? Somewhere says Toshma, okay, so we saw in the Mishnah that the technical permission to eat on the job is only literally while you're on the job. However, for the benefit of the owner, we said that he can eat when he's walking from row to row, or when he's walking to and from the press. Savru, we thought mahalach ka'isam aisidami. 1 second. The walking that we're talking about here is the walking that's necessary for doing the job. Like, for example, walking from row to row. So the owner tells you harvest the field, and you're walking from row to row. So it's part of your work. And but because he's not actually working with the plant, he's just walking because the owner told him to walk, because that's included in the job, then biblically speaking, he's not entitled to eat the fruit. Alma, we see from here that Oisa begefen se, Eini Oichel begefen Acher. Why is it that biblically speaking, you're not eligible to eat while you're walking from row to row? The answer must be, according to the way we explained, because you're working on one vine and eating a different vine, which is prohibited. You're only allowed to eat on the vine that you're actually working. Because in this case, he's not working on any vines, so he doesn't get to eat anything. And that's why the rabbis had to enact a decree that even though since he's still working for the owner, he's allowed to eat fruit while he's walking from row to row. So Gemara says, "Loi, this is not a good proof." The truth of the matter is, it could be that when you're working with one vine, you can eat from a different vine. However, what's different? Like we said, the entire permission of the Torah to eat is when you're working on the ground, when you're working harvesting. But while you're walking from row to row, that's not part of the harvest. So you don't have your biblical permission slip to eat. And that's why you can't eat. Not because you're working on one tree and eating from a different tree, but because you're not working. You don't have a job that allows you to eat. And therefore you can't eat. Okay. Ekadamri, another slightly different version of this Gemara. Savru mahalach la'afka isamaisa dami. We're of the opinion that walking does not constitute an action. Behind the time of the rights le'achol mishum de la'afka isamaisa dami. Okay, according to this version, we sort of understood that walking from row to row does not constitute a maisa, an action that would allow you to eat fruit. That's why the rabbis made the decree. But the implication of this is ha'isa maisa acham deraisa. But if it were to be considered an action, then you would be permitted to eat while walking from row to row. Well, why would you be permitted to eat while walking from row to row? Must be when you're eating in one you're allowed to eat in a different tree than you're working. Meaning, if we're of the opinion that says that mahalach is ka'isa, meaning the fact that you're walking from row to row is considered still working in the ground. You're doing what the owner said you should do. It's part of the harvest. If the implication of the statement is that in that scenario you would be able to eat. The reason why, biblically speaking, you can't eat while walking from row to row is because it's not considered an action. But if it was considered an action, you would be able to eat. Why? How can you eat? It must be because even though you're working in one vine, you could still eat in a different vine, which proves exactly the point they were trying to make. That working in one vine will allow you to eat from a different vine. It says no. If you're working in one vine, you can't eat from a different one. 1 second. And even though walking is considered an action, meaning it's considered the work of the owner, but it could be it's not considered the type of work that pertains to harvesting. Meaning, right now when you're walking from row to row, you're not harvesting, and therefore you would not be able to eat, even if we value your action as part of the work that the owner has told you to do. Fine. Let's continue next. A donkey, when it's being unloaded, is allowed to eat fruit. So the Gemara says, how exactly can donkey eat from the fruit that it's carrying if while it's being unloaded? Rashi presumes here that the unloading happens very, very quickly. Maybe it's just one, it happens all at once. So if it happens all at once, the animal could have eaten beforehand, but can no longer eat afterwards, because the action happens at once. So until the animal's unloaded, the animal can eat from its own burden, because that's the law. It's still carrying a burden, it's still engaged in work. And once it's unloading, well, it happens instantly. If that's the case, obviously it can't eat anymore. So the Gemara says, meaning the animal can eat while it's waiting to be unloaded. So even though it's not carrying anything, well, it is carrying, but it's not moving. So the load is on it, but the animal isn't moving. The animal can still eat until it's unloaded. We have a brayso that indicates this. You have that indicates this that we learned in the Mishnah. You have a donkey or a camel; they can eat from the burden that they carry. But one is not allowed to feed them the bundle that they were carrying. Because if they can reach it, whatever they can reach, they can take. Whatever they can't reach, you can't feed them. Okay, Mishnah. Eichel poel kishus v'afilu dinner. Okay, so how much can you hire a worker? He's allowed to eat. How much can he eat on the job? So the first opinion says he can eat even very expensive fruit. So expensive, it might even be more expensive than the work that he's doing. Keseves, a date, v'afilu b'dinner, even if it's a very expensive date. Rabbi Elazar Chisma Omer, lo yochel poel yeser al schari. Rabbi Elazar says a worker is not allowed to eat more than the amount of the salary that he charges, the amount of hours that he's working, the billable payments. Okay. The Chachamim matirim, and the rabbis say it is permitted. Aval malamdim es ha'adam shelo yehei ravsan, v'yisotzim es ha'pesach b'fanav. The rabbis say you're allowed to eat more than your labor. However, we teach people there shouldn't be a ravsan. In Yiddish is a word called a fresser. A glutton. He shouldn't be a fresser. And basically nobody would want to hire him because, if he's eating that much, more than his salary on a regular basis, he's not going to have
Rabbi, right? What if he's a professor?
Okay, says the Gemara. Chachamim hainu Kamma. You look at the Mishnah. The first opinion of the Mishnah says the guy is allowed to eat an expensive cucumber, even if it's more than a dinner, meaning that's effectively more than his salary. It doesn't cost a dinner to cut a cucumber. And the last.
So Rabbi, I'm sorry. Are you in effect asking what's for dinner?
The last opinion of the Mishnah, the rabbi's opinion, says it's also permitted to eat more than your salary, but we don't advise you to do it. Well, isn't the first opinion and the last opinion the same opinion? Both of them are of the opinion that you're allowed to eat more than you get paid. 1 second. So the Gemara says, so the question is basically, do you give the guy an admonishment? Do you admonish him for eating too much? So according to the rabbis, the second rabbinical opinion, you do. According to the first opinion, you don't. Another possibility is the opinion of Ravasi, the Amar Ravasi, there are two versions of Ravasi. The first version is that if you hire him to cut one cluster of grapes, he's allowed to eat the cluster you told him to cut. According to the first opinion, that is permitted. You can eat the only cluster that you were hired to cut. However, according to the last opinion, according to the rabbi's opinion, you can't. Wait a second. Meaning to eat all of your work, according to the rabbi's opinion, is not permitted. You're allowed to eat more than your work in value, but to eat your entire work, the chachamim, the rabbis, would not allow that. Okay. 1 second. Okay. Now, there's another version of Ravasi. So the first version of Ravasi is where you were hired to cut one cluster. The second version is where you were hired to cut a row of clusters. You cut one and then you ate it. You can eat the first thing that you cut. So again, there's two opinions of Ravasi. Number one is if you're hired to cut one cluster, just one, you can eat the one cluster that you were hired to cut. And number two is that you can eat that if you're hired to cut a bunch of clusters, a whole row of them, then you can eat the first cluster that was cut. So the Gemara says, well, why does Rav Asi need to tell you both of these opinions? So the Gemara says, it's necessary. If it would have just said the first opinion, meaning just one cluster he's cutting, there's a massive chiddush here. The idea of Rav Asi that you can basically eat the entire job is to put it mildly, it's very, very interesting. It's very interesting. So it's okay if he has this interesting opinion that you can eat the only thing you're hired to do, fine. But if you're hired to do multiples, maybe first do for the owner and then eat, because you'll have what to eat. There's no question about that. So I wouldn't know that Rav Asi would say that you can eat the first cluster. Maybe you can only eat the later clusters. The Yeshin Baha, if it would have only said the second scenario of eating the first cluster of many, I would say the Efshel Kiyum L'B'Seif. Well, at least the guy's going to harvest for you. He'll do some work. But if the guy is literally eating his work, maybe that would not be permitted. So therefore, tzricha, we had to have both statements of Ravasi. You can eat the only cluster and you can eat the first cluster. Okay. Again, back to the Gemara. So what's the difference again between the Tanakh, what we call the Kamma, the first unauthored opinion, unnamed opinion, and the second Chacham, the second rabbinical opinion? See, by Sam, another possibility is the difference of opinion is the Rav, the opinion of Rav. This is also very interesting. The Amar Rav says, Matzasim Megillah Starim. I found a hidden scroll. Why was the scroll hidden? So Rashi explains it was sort of somebody's private notes. At that point, they did not write they did not write notes. It was before the Talmud was written down. So the Talmud was not supposed to be recorded. And if somebody was afraid he was going to forget something, he wrote down a note and then he hid it. So he found one of these hidden scrolls in the study hall. In the study hall of Rav Chia. Because of it said in it, Isi ben Yehudah Aimer, Isi ben Yehudah says, according to Isi ben Yehudah, any person who walks into a vineyard is allowed to eat from the vineyard. The verse is not referring to a worker. We say that a worker is permitted to eat in the vineyard. It's this verse. You're working your friend's field. It says Isi ben Yehudah, no. You're not even working. You're just walking through his field. You can eat whatever you want. We'll have to, obviously this is a. Rav says that Isi is not letting anyone live because nobody can, it's not worth it for anyone to plant that people can walk through your field and enjoy it. Vashi, one second here. Okay. And according to this version of the Gemara, the opinion of Isi would depend on the Tanna Kamma or the rabbis. The first opinion of the Mishnah would hold that that only a worker is allowed to eat, and the Chachamim, the rabbi's opinion, they hold that anyone would be allowed to eat. Okay, in other words, why do the rabbis say you can eat more than your job? Because everyone could eat. That's the explanation. The first opinion holds that you can eat as much as you cut, but no more. So in other words, he disagrees with Isi. He holds only a worker is allowed to eat on the job. Now, with regard to this very, very interesting statement of Isi ben Yehudah that basically anyone's allowed to eat from anyone's field. So Amar Vashi, Amrisa L'Shmaitza Kameder of Kahana. I said this statement in front of Kahana, and I said to him, Amar Li, Rav Kahana said to me, Dilma ba'oisen b'seudasam d'avdu v'achlu. Maybe it doesn't mean every person. Maybe it just means that workers from that owner are allowed to eat from that field, even if they're not engaged in harvesting. Isi didn't mean to say that anyone can walk through anyone's field. No, Isi meant to say that if you're hired by somebody and you're walking through his field to get to the job, which is not a job of harvesting, you have a different job, then you'd be allowed to eat from his field. If you're working for you're working for him and you're providing your own food, then you'd be allowed to eat. Amrli, so he said to me, "Afilo hachi nichalei leinish le'aiger agurei v'niktifei le'pardesei v'lo ne'sekul am of achlei." I'm sorry, my apologies. I misspoke here. Ba'asim suda does not mean workers. Mistake. Ba'asim suda means that it's close over here. It's closer to it's like a volunteer. So in other words, the verse is saying is that not only are hired laborers that are harvesting permitted to eat, volunteers that come to eat, that come to work and eat for their pay are also permitted to eat. And that okay, so basically it's not as crazy. The verse is saying that workers can eat, and also, volunteers that eat for their volunteer work are also allowed to eat. So the Gemara says that Rav Kahana said back to him, Rav said back to him, Rav afilu hachi nichale leinish laguri aguri v'nitif v'peditzav le'nisekul of achlei. Gemara says that it still doesn't resolve the problem, because most people would rather not have volunteers picking their fruit. They'd rather have hired workers and then and pay them and allow them to eat from the orchard. Okay, next question. It's a very interesting question. The worker is allowed to eat on the job. Why is he allowed to eat on the job? Is this considered an obligation that the owner has to him, or is this considered a heavenly
concession to the inevitable?
Sorry,
Rabbi. I guess wrong. I said a concession to the inevitable. They're going to do it anyway.
No. That's a good point. That's a good point. But the question here is, how do we view the obligation? Is this an obligation that is a sort of religious in nature, or is it more of a monetary obligation? That's the way I'll put it for you now. I think it actually fits through most of the Gemara. Although technically, to be more precise, the Gemara is asking, is it the obligation of the owner, or is Mishal Shemayim is something akin to just like you have an obligation to leave a corner of your field for the poor, so too you have an obligation. It's a religious obligation to leave some food behind for your workers. Okay, what's the difference here? That's what everyone's waiting for. What's the difference? Very simple. Give it to my wife and kids. If it's a monetary obligation, so Yavina, then why can't he transfer his obligation to his kids? In other words, the owner of the field, the worker can transfer his right to eat, the owner's obligation to feed him, to his kids. Now the owner is obligated to feed his kids or his wife. But if you'll say that it's sort of a religious obligation, the Torah only says a worker gets to eat. You don't get to pass on that gift. Right? A poor person can't say, you know what, this year instead of doing pay at the corner of the field, you give me a check and you're exempt from pay. No, it's not how God wrote the Torah. God said the gift to the poor is the pay. You can't just a poor person doesn't have a right to reassign what God's commandments were. Similarly, a worker doesn't have a right to reassign his benefit to his kids. It's not up to him. So the Gemara says, Toshma, afilu b'dinner. He can eat this very expensive cucumber, kaseves, a date, afilu b'dinner, even if it's very expensive. Okay, meaning, as a question, if you say that it's an obligation from the owner to the worker, does it make sense that a guy is working for $10 an hour and eating $100 worth of fruit? No. So how's such a thing possible? So Gemara says, so what are you telling me? That sort of God allows him to eat it. It's like a tithe. It's like payah. Does it make sense that somebody could be working for $10 and eat $100 worth of food? Well, what's the resolution? This is what the Torah allows you to eat. Whether the Torah gave it as an obligation between the owner and the worker, or whether the Torah gave it as a obligation that God commands the owner to provide, either way, that it is what it is. And yeah, it is possible to work for $10 and eat $100 worth of food. The Torah requires this. Tashma, Rabbi Lazar says you can't eat more than your labor, and the rabbis say it's permitted. It must be, this is the debate. Very simple. According to Rabbi Lazar, you eat, the obligation to feed is an obligation from owner to worker. And obviously the amount to eat cannot exceed the labor obligation. And that's why he says you're limited to the amount you can eat is limited by the amount of salary that you're earning. But the Chachamim, the rabbis that permit it, they're of the opinion that say Mishal Shemayim Moechel, that it has nothing to do with your salary. The Torah says that a worker gets to eat, just like the Torah says that an owner leaves payah. So therefore, it's not problematic at all if you end up eating more than your salary. So Gemara says, that's not necessarily the debate. Everyone can agree that there's a direct obligation from employer to worker or owner to worker. Over here, the debate is how to understand the words of kinafshecha. This verse is one of the two verses that indicate that you can eat on the job, and it says kinafshcha. Now, this in context, this is to be understood like eat to your heart's desire. Where heart here is like the loosest of terms. Doesn't mean your heart, obviously, eat your stomach's desire. Okay, whatever it is, it's an expression. But literally, it's coming to teach us. There's two things that can be coming to teach us. What is kinafshcha? So nefesh is like your soul. Wow, so important. Why is it so important? Mar savar kinafshcha b'dover shemoiser nafshe olav. 1 second. Okay, nafshcha here refers to the job, because obviously the job of harvesting for certain types of foodstuffs carries risk to it, right? You're climbing on trees, so it's a risky endeavor. So, and the Torah says you can eat as much as the risk that you took, meaning as much as your salary. So kanavshcha, like your soul, means like the amount of risk you're taking for the job, i.e., the amount of the cost of your labor. And the other opinion says, the other one says, no, it has nothing to do with labor. It has to do with the fact that just like an owner is able to control himself and refuse to eat while working on the job, he can ask the worker to agree to the same condition. The worker is allowed to waive his right to eat, but because it has nothing to do with labor, so therefore there's no limitation of eating more than your labor. According to the first opinion, the verse specifically says you cannot eat more than your labor. According to the second version, the verse doesn't address it at all. It addresses a second side point, and therefore you could eat more. You are allowed to eat more than your labor because we don't have a verse that specifically excludes it. Okay, Toshma. Nazir she'amar tenu le'ishti yabanav. So you have a nazir who's harvesting a vineyard. Bad idea, by the way, and we'll get to it in more detail. Okay, but obviously he's not allowed to eat on the job. He's a nazir, and nazir is not allowed to eat wine or any grape products or grapes themselves. So he says tenu le'ishti yabanav. He says, give it to my wife and kids. Ain't shemele, we don't listen to him. 1 second, hold on. Why don't we listen to him? Right? If it's mishaloi, if it's an obligation from employer to worker, he said he can give away the obligation. So why can't he give the obligation to his wife and kids? He can't enjoy the grapes anyway. This is because a nazir does not belong in a vineyard. We push a nazir away from a vineyard, and therefore we say to a nazir, we're not letting you give it to your kids because we don't want you working in a vineyard. Okay. Now we get to a bunch of Gemaras, which is like the Gemara is willing to be very, very accommodating here to the opinion, and we'll have a whole bunch of Gemaras that are a few proofs, 2-3 proofs that are talking about workers, and we'll actually say that they're talking about Nazirim, even though there's no indication that they are Nazirim. So Tashma, next one. A worker says, give it to my wife and kids, you don't listen to him. Well, what does that mean? But if you say it's a direct obligation from employer to worker, why can't he give away his obligation? His right. Why can't the worker give away his right? Reassign the employer's obligation. So the Gemara says, my pile nazir. The pile here is a nazir. And because we don't want the nazir in the vineyard, that's why we don't let him give the obligation to his kids. So the Gemara says, Vatanya nazir, Vatanya pile. We have two brises. One brise says nazir, one brise says pile, a worker. Presumably that's because the worker isn't a nazir. So Gemara says, Midi Gabi Adodatanyan, are they one brisa? No, they're two separate brises, and they're both referring to the same thing, a nazir. Tashma. How do we know that you don't listen to a worker who tells you give it to my wife and kids? Shenever is the first.
Page position, please.
I'm sorry?
Page position, please.
Second to bottom line.
Thank you.
Last of the third to bottom line on 92a. The verse admonishes the worker, don't put it into your own vessels. Says the Gemara, what does that mean? Don't give it to your wife and kids. You can't reassign the obligation that the employer has to the worker to your wife and kids. That's the equivalent of putting it into your own vessels. Okay, so the Gemara says v'chitem, and if you'll say hachanami, hachanami nazir, we're referring here to a nazir as well. If we're referring to a nazir, the reason why a nazir can't give fruit to his wife and kids is because the fruit in question is grapes, and we don't want the nazir in the vineyard. Not because he's putting it into his own vessels. That has nothing to do with the fact. The real thing is that we don't want the nazir in the vineyard. The reason is because we tell the nazir to stay out of the vineyard. So Gemara says, "Enachanami, you're right." Gemara says the truth of the matter is we're talking about a nazir, and because we've used the terminology of a pile worker, therefore we gave a different verse. But the real reason here is not actually that verse. The real reason here is because he's a nazir. This is like I said, bending over backwards. Tashma, this will be the last proof for the last line of the page. He hires a worker to dry out the figs in the grove, whatever it's called, whatever the orchard, wherever you grow the figs. So the worker is exempt from Meiser, like we explained. While it's in the field, he wants to dry it out, so it's still not finished yet. So you're exempt from Meiser. Let's say he makes a condition with the employer. He says, "Here's the deal. I'm working for you. On condition that me and my son get to eat. So or that my son get to eat instead of me. So he eats and he's exempt from Meiser. And his son eats and is liable. Why is his son obligated to take off Meiser? Because it's like a sale. He's selling his labor for the Meiser. For the figs. And because once you sell figs, even if they weren't ready to be eaten yet, you're obligated to take off Meiser. Similarly here too, because you're selling your labor for the figs that aren't ready to eat, that sort of prepares the figs for the obligation of Meiser. And if you say that you eat, that the obligation is direct from employer to worker, so why is his son obligated to take off Meiser? His son just has the same obligation as him. It's the same thing. He just transferred it to his son. So Gemara says, Ravina says, you're right. Truth is, you shouldn't be chayav. You shouldn't be liable. However, mishum de mechzik mekach, it looks like it's a sale, and therefore rabbinically they said, okay, you have to treat this as if it's a sale and take off Meiser. Okay, continue tomorrow. Have a great day.